welcome to Writers and Books Meet the BOA Authors series. I'm Kathy Sevna, the Communications Associate here. For those of you who are new to us, Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, a bookstore, and literary programming for people of all ages and backgrounds. You can find more information at our website, wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the chat or Q&A function as well. Books are available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books, and I'll make sure to put the link in the chat. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are hosting this event from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, or the Keeper of the Western Door. We're so happy to have Margaret Ray with us tonight. First, we'll hear her read, then she'll be in conversation with author and poet Peter Connors, publisher and executive director of BOA Editions. Selected by Stephanie Burt as the winner of the A. Poulin Jr. Poetry Prize, Good Grief the Ground interrogates the everyday violences nonchalantly inflicted onto women through personal, political, and national lenses. Margaret Ray grew up in Gainesville, Florida, and holds an MFA from Warren Wilson College, a winner of the Third Coast Poetry Prize and a chapbook fellowship from the Poetry Society of America for her chapbook Superstitions of the Mid-Atlantic. Her poems have appeared in Narrative, the Gettysburg Review, Threepenny Review, Michigan Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, Alaska Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. She teaches in New Jersey. Welcome, Margaret, and enjoy.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for being here, friends. All right, I'm going to start with one of my poems with a really long title. This is called While Wandering in Montreal, I Mistake Desire for that feeling you get when you actually want to be another person. If I look at a woman outside this grocery, I won't say waif-like, won't say boyish, her shaved head, her thin neck. These are words I've been taught by male writers. How can my looking be different or differently charged if I still want to look at her body? But all I have are the same old words. Here people are speaking in French, which sounds soft, romantic, but it's a language of invaders like English. Just think how it got here. I got here by driving across the border from Vermont and also via a violent history of colonization. I am looking at this woman and wanting. Maybe I can turn instead to my own breath, elevated temperature only slightly. Where is the border between wanting and wanting to be, wanting to touch her skin or live inside it? I watch Killing Eve and I think, oh, I want to dress up and be someone else. Oh, I want her to cut me like that. I'm going to read a couple of the Florida poems that are at the beginning of the book. This one's called Making Out at the Movies, after Frank O'Hara. There was always gum involved, back row under the projector. Sometimes I wanted to, sometimes I didn't, but let it happen anyway, because once you agreed, those were the rules. Sometimes I went to the bathroom and put a coin in the Pac-Man machine in the lobby instead, that dark confetti print carpet smelling of stale butter, the concession stand cashiers outside for a smoke or leaning conspiratorially against the counter, facing somewhere else, I didn't care, away from me. The boy had been brought up in church. I hadn't, but that didn't save me feeling shame all the time. I was so absorbent. I remember the smell of his saliva around my lips, scraps of dialogue from whatever B movie we'd bought tickets to, because it would be mostly empty and was playing at the right time. God was everywhere but with me, and I was superstitious. Kids of America, let yourself go to good movies. There are things you can absorb without meaning to, like that you can tell sincerity by its sound, or that protagonists are mostly white, or that there are whole genres where the woman evaporates during the good parts, or that people usually know what they want. After, it was always a relief to emerge from the over-air-conditioned building, to thaw in the steamy Florida night, frogs and insects setting up an electric throb from the retention pond between the theater and the strip mall. I could go home then, having played my part convincingly, my face in the dark, screen, projector, dust. I played basketball for a long time, so I'm going to read one of my high school basketball poems. This is called Hail Mary. The gym at the rural high school, 45 minutes outside of town, no AC, just the giant fans set in the walls, rotating lazily like B-52 propellers warming up on the runway, slicing up the sunlight as it hits the hardwood floor. Smell of dust and resin in the humid Florida afternoon. In the locker room was where Jay told me she was more than a week late and worried she was pregnant. Then she got 8 rebounds, though she was no taller than me and played wing. And I thought about it every time I saw her take an elbow in the gut. I had always been the one who watched her, not sure what it was I was looking for, strong and fearless under the rim, the way she'd throw her body to the floor for a loose ball. And that day she became, for me, a goddess, as she sat sweating on the locker room bench at halftime, elbows on her knees, a glow of danger and ferocity pulsing off her. I don't think she'd told anyone else, but she wouldn't let me catch her eye during the game, which we lost when their point guard hit a buzzer beater from half court. And on the bus back, she sat sleeping or pretending to sleep under her hood, Discman turned all the way up. The way our lives could bend around this thing, that knowledge grew between us, a blade we would have to carry later, mothering ourselves or anything that came along. Everyone I know is going through some kind of terrible ongoing grief in the past few years, probably everyone you know too. So I've been thinking a lot about different shapes of grief and containers that can hold it. And so I'm just going to read a couple of these little sort of shorter grief vehicle poems in the second half of the book. Grief is a sudden room. Grief is a sudden room. After flailing around, breaking all the furniture inside it for a time, you can think you've shut the ancient door behind you as you left, but the latch hasn't worked for eons. It will just spring open anytime you open a window elsewhere in your mind. No matter. The room will arrange itself in your absence and wait for your return. You've never seen such patience. After. Elle comes over and we walk turns around the block. This is what we're allowed. A cardinal appearing, a flash of red, something she says, how beautiful. And this is what beauty is for, a trap to make us stay. We leave a mess, don't we? I repeat her words and it feels almost like fluency, like belief, almost like love. We're still alive here. We live on the ground mostly. This next one is for my beloved friend Anita, and it's called Peaches. Everything has intentions of its own, even this knife. A knife's intention is to cut, which is what I am using it for, cutting this peach into underripe wedges because either patience or flies come next. So here is the knife filling my hand with intent so full I almost cut my thumb across the 2-year-old scar of just such intentions. The pit into the plastic trash bag where it will rot unproductively. We're not doing our best. Intending to help, your phone keeps suggesting you add your mother to emails, not good enough to have taken her silence for absence. The peach isn't good, but can you imagine? Next year, there may be peaches again. This one is addressed to my, I'm a pretty anxious person, and so I tried to write a poem to my anxieties as if they're a benevolent force trying to take care of me. So that's what this one is. Along for the ride. Sweet fears, don't worry. The windshield wipers work. See those flakes in the air? Don't worry. They're off somewhere melting. Our view will be clear. Look at this exit before us. We don't have to stay on this grief highway always. Look, turn just a little and we can pull over. Don't worry, my worries. Don't worry, my fears. Leave the windows just cracked and I'll run in. I'll bring you your favorites, news and malaise and some Cheez-its for me. Look, I won't leave for long. I know this is just how you know how to love me. I'll just be a minute. I promise. Don't watch. Don't look. I'm going. I'm gone. This one is a love poem, and it's called First and Then and Then. We'd watched too much Battlestar Galactica in the weeks leading up to the big anniversary of the moon landing, so it seemed like a really minor deal when it came around, and all the news outlets and search engines couldn't let up about it. Truly impressive things happen every day here in the future, like the miracle of LASIK eye surgery gone right and the lady down the street who microchipped her dog. Satellites clutter up the night sky, and we're still adding to the list of things that can kill us, but it is a good idea to keep thinking about how symbolic firsts are orchestrated. I couldn't very well have done anything other than carry myself across the threshold of my first apartment all those years ago, when happiness had seemed as far away as the moon, which it turned out was 2 days by rocket, and also thousands of years of humanity staring into space. And anyway, carry becomes the wrong verb for anything other than attune in both zero gravity and self-sufficient womanhood. Whether we know it or not, the world has already handed us our lines for when we come to grief, though method acting is optional. I've been gathering reports of people whose second lives have bent towards joy. Look at you, here in my life, the machine of the world that set us in orbit together, my astonishment undimmed by the daily sight of you entering a room or the sound of your whistling carrying through the door. To close, I'm going to read three of the poems about Wanda, who is a character who visits the book between sections, and I've only ever read one of these out loud for other people before, maybe because they feel like poems that most embody something like real hope and wonder, which for some reason feels the most vulnerable of all to me sometimes. So here's the first one. It's called Wanda is a Particle Physicist. Wanda sparkles with curiosity and competence, and no one underestimates her. The events of her day are unenraging, and she moves through the physics buildings unmolested. Wanda works on things so small she has to take them on a kind of faith, knowing them only by disturbances they leave in the visible world. Visible, not quite the word. Wanda's computer does what she tells it, while in a shaft of sunlight in her office, some dust motes float, suspended. That she sees them is certain, they are real. She stares through sunlight, thinking how it is that love forms an outline of its object. Wanda looks back at the traces her particles have left, moving through a field. Wanda in the world. In the coffee shop near campus, Wanda sits with an undergraduate who tells her she finds the outdated technology of her own body ridiculous. She would prefer to be a mind downloaded on a fancy computer. That's the student's phrase, outdated technology, and Wanda remembers wanting to erase the leaky vessel in which she moves through the world. Now Wanda thinks of biting into a plum's taut skin, and pizza labeled Lust auf Fleisch from the conference in Berlin last year. Wanda dwells deliciously on her own incarnateness, enmeated in the flesh, her urgent near medical need to reach out and touch any textured surface, her lover's skin, velour, and sure, snakes. Wanda wants to pause and smile, sing the body to this student, but she knows it's really just her younger self she'd make her case to here today, and Wanda knows to let young people love the world in their own way. For this last one, the thing you need to know, it's the last of the Wanda poems, and it's the last poem in the book, is something you probably already know, which is that the concept of entanglement from quantum physics is a phenomenon when particles remain connected so that actions performed on one affect the other, even when separated by great distances. And supposedly the phenomenon so riled Einstein that he called it spooky action at a distance. So this poem is called At a Distance. Wanda leaves her nail polish in the photon lab for the 7th time this term. Redshift red, it's called, the color of receding. The Cavendish is cold this time of year, but news from the university at Delft is of entanglement. Even while she reads the memo, Wanda thinks instead of what a color knows of cues. Blue knows about announcements like approaching light. In that other Delft school, how Vermeer's windows enunciate this daily miracle, whispered assurances of how little we know or what remains unsaid. A woman holding scales, receiving letters, or just attending to the milk and bread. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
So fun to hear those read in your voice after like reading them so many times over and over. I have to say it fit. That is what I thought that would sound like coming from you. Thank you so much for sharing those. Since you end with the Wanda poem, let's talk some about Wanda. How did she come about? How did she make her way into your work? And what is her role in your book?
Yeah, Wanda is this last poem that I just read, and that is the last poem is in the book, is one of the first poems I wrote, actually. And for a long time, it felt like this kind of sore thumb in the manuscript. It didn't have these companion poems, and I was worried I was going to have to cut it. And then at some point during the pandemic, I had one of those insomnia nights where I didn't sleep at all, and because I couldn't, and wrote all the other poems at once. And had been thinking about how I wanted some kind of counterweight to a lot of the grief that this collection is about and that these poems are about. And I don't know why, but for some reason, externalizing a feeling of sort of hope and wonder and putting it in a character that's not me or a persona made that sort of come together for me in a way that felt possible. Yeah.
Do you see more Wanda poems in your future, or is she?
I don't know. I really like her.
Yeah.
So I would like to be like her. Yeah, so in that way, I would love to write more about her, and sort of, I see her as this sort of aspirational alter ego in a different field who manages to find wonder and yeah, sort of twinning curiosity and joy in a way that I find in my life when I'm feeling my best, or when I'm reading something I really love, or learning about something that is really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because there aren't a ton of Wanda poems in the book, but
Yeah.
she does create a real presence, and I think you've woven them through so skillfully that that presence remains strong throughout, even though it's not overbearing. So, especially because this is your first collection, and we usually have some people listening and watching who are hoping to get their first book published and maybe on that same journey. Can you share some about your journey with this collection, how it started, your submission process, and also the call letting you know that you won?
Yeah, sure. I guess, yeah, for a long time, a lot of these poems sort of started in my MFA at Warren Wilson, and may have changed shape since then. But probably about half or three-quarters of the book or something I wrote after Warren Wilson, which, yeah, if anyone who's listening knows about finishing an MFA program and then trying to keep your writing practice alive, sort of feels like getting cut loose all of a sudden, and not having somebody to be accountable to and send your work to. So it changed shape a lot. I caught a lot of poems that were bad, and I think I sent it out for the first time in a slightly different form before it had all the Wanda poems, and before it had some of these other poems too. So yeah, I think I was sending it out probably for, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 years, but replacing poems as I did, and kind of figuring out the shape, and actually figuring out the Wanda poems was kind of a breakthrough of realizing what the sections might look like, and what I was trying to really not have it be a book all about one thing. And so initially there were a lot more poems that could have fit in those middle sections that ended up getting cut. And yeah, I guess if you're thinking about sending a book out, it's just sort of trusting the better version of your book is the one that's going to end up in the world, and not the kind of messy first version that might still be worth sending out because you might learn something about it by having to suddenly think about it from somebody else's eyes. But yeah. And then I got this call about a year ago from you, and it was like this wonderful, I'm a teacher, I teach high school, and I was just sort of, I think I got a missed call from Rochester at the end of my day, and I was telling my partner that, I was like, there's this really great press in Rochester, and whenever I get a spam call with that area code on it, I think to myself, wouldn't it be great if it were politicians calling me? And it was just like yeah, made my whole life. It was great.
Have you shared, I don't know, your poems or the book with your students? Has that been a part of your teaching?
Not really. I think some of them know about it, and there's some when one of them finds something out, they kind of spread it around a little bit. I try to be a sort of like a Clark Kent sort of person when I'm teaching. Or yeah, I don't know. They always want to ask me about it, which I think is their way of trying to derail class. So I just tell them, you can Google it if you want, but yeah.
Fair enough. I'm sure you're spot on about the derailing as well. By the way, if anybody listening would like to submit a question, you're welcome to do that in the chat, and I'm sort of keeping an eye on it if you would like to, just so you know. So throughout the book, you have a lot of symbolism of like fruit and gardens in different poems. So can you talk some about the symbolism there and what those mean to you?
Yeah, some of that is actually sort of a ghost of an earlier version of the book, which was I was trying to come up with some title about the garden or something, and thinking about that biblical myth. There is still a book in the poem titled with Eve in the name. I think because I was thinking about sort of a refusal of some pre-lapsarian idea of paradise, and thinking a lot about thought a lot about what shows up in the last poem, or the second to last poem of the book, which I'll read at the end, but about I don't know, just all the sort of deliciousness of the imperfections of the world and people, um and thinking about how a messy garden is the kind of garden that I like, and not a kind of really overly weeded, overly manicured sort of, yeah, something that doesn't feel very real. But yeah, that's kind of a rambling answer. Thinking about Eve and wanting her to be a kind of ghost in the book, but not to center stage, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I always love those like overgrown front yards that are kind of like garden and just left to go, and
Yes.
sort of I
Yeah.
could see that sort of working its way into. And you don't write directly about food very much in the book, but I've read a quote from you that said there is a relationship between writing and making physical food for people I love. So I'm curious if you could expand on that. And also, it is interesting that you don't write much about food in this book, but maybe an earlier version had more food poems. Who knows?
Yeah, I guess the place where it shows up most obviously here is that poem Peaches from my friend Anita, which feels to me, the more I think about it, like a kind of bad Ars Poetica, where the peach is a kind of offering in the poem, but it's not a very good one. And I don't know, I'm trying to think about the ways in which writing about grief, especially other people's grief, is always kind of inadequate and not up to the task of holding this person who you love. Yeah, and food feels related to that for me. I think in another poem that I didn't read, there's a bit about having a knife, and thinking the knife is for revenge, and having the knife actually be about making things and cooking. And I think that's when the knife shows up in this book. I'm thinking about that, and how there's a lot of things in life, knives are one of them, but you could name any number of things which put to ill use are really dangerous, obviously. But when used well, you end up making something lovely or beautiful. Yeah, like a meal for somebody, something nourishing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's what good poetry does for me. When books I return to feels like eating something, kind of, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of there was a quote in the foreword that Stephanie wrote, and it really seems to connect well to what your answer you just gave. And she says, Margaret Ray sees injustice all around and understands how many of us want support, want somewhere to stand. We say to ourselves, you don't love me yet, and we wonder if we ever will. It's a lot there.
Yeah. Yeah, that line, "You Don't Love Me Yet," comes from a Volker Boatman song, which is a band I grew up with because it's my father's band. And that's always been one of my favorite songs of theirs. And yeah, I've repurposed it in a couple of these poems to be sort of talking to myself or talking to a younger version of myself and thinking about, I especially, but probably everybody looks back at younger versions of of themselves and thinks, what a fool, what an idiot, what a mess, what a, she didn't know anything. And I know that I'll still look back on this version of me now and have that same thought, what little I knew, what little I know, but.
It's probably a sign of evolution.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, speaking of the internal voice too, along for the ride is really, to me, it's such a sweet, it's just like a tender poem to oneself, and you don't see that a lot. I think, we see sort of these comforting poems written to other people or to one's child or whatever it might be. But I love the idea of that voice that you're really, it feels to me like trying to conjure up, against your nature, to soothe. And I don't know if there's a question in there, but I just want to say that I really appreciate that poem. And I guess part of me wants to ask you, like, has that voice penetrated more since you've written that poem? And I wonder if it's a poem that you come back to sometimes, because it would seem useful in that way.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad you like that one. It felt like it's not one I usually pull out as I don't know, just because it feels kind of, I don't know. Yeah, it's talking to myself, and I think it does help to sort of think of what I think of as sort of brain weather. Enormously anxious moments that seem to come on for almost no reason is a kind of weather passing through. And that poem is about trying to talk to those moments as if they're trying to take care of me, even though they're not. They're trying to do something to keep me safe or feel, I don't know, protected in the world or something. And writing that poem helps sort of externalize it for me in a way of thinking about that it's this, if I can sort of turn it into a benevolent thing, I can maybe externalize it and say, thank you, but I don't need that right now. It doesn't always work, but yeah.
It's a valiant attempt. We do what we can.
Yeah.
So there's a question here that I want to read to you in the chat, and it is from Sarah Audsley. And
Hey, Sarah.
the question is, I think you skillfully handle whiteness and gender in many of these poems. How was crafting these aspects of the poems for you in your writing process?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it has to do with stuff. I just wrote this essay trying to think through this too. Both gender and race feel to me like things that were sort of invisible to me until I started to grow up. Part of that on the race side is obviously has to do with privilege and not having to think about it. And on the gender side, I don't know why I didn't really think about it much. It just didn't seem worthy of examination. It seemed kind of uninteresting to me when I was growing up. And so part of thinking about it for this book has been kind of hauling out that unexamined, previously unexamined adolescent version of not thinking about those things and relooking at old memories through the lens of not realizing what was protecting me or not realizing what it was that was endangering me, or what had sort of, which of those aspects had kind of written a script for me that I had sort of internalized and spat out without examining or thinking about or even realizing was a script in the first place. I think especially because those two things can be in tension sometimes, being sort of moving through the world in a way that looks gendered female can be sort of vulnerable, and moving through the world in whiteness is power. And the sort of tension between those two things is, I think, useful ground to dig in for poetry, thinking about where those two things intersect. Yeah, that was kind of a clumsy answer, but thank you, Sarah, for that question.
Yes, Stephanie mentions that also in her foreword. She said it's also a book by a poet who knows that she's white and can write about it. A relief after how many generations of white writers who consider whiteness unmarked? Which I like the use of that word unmarked.
Yeah, the unmarked is such a good word. I love what she said about that. And yeah, thinking about, I mean, I'm a teacher, so I think all the time about how to present text to students by all kinds of writers, but how to not present whiteness as this kind of given neutral when we're looking at texts. So that's always in the back of my mind as a teacher, and it probably blends over into my writing as well.
I'm curious if there are any poets or books that you're reading right now that you want to shout out and talk about a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Sarah's book is one of them. I have it back here on my stack. Sarah's book, Landlocked X, this book is incredible. It's really good. Yeah, think about re-examining pasts and inherited histories. I've also been rereading Hugh Min-Win's book, Not Here, recently. And that book is really, really rich. Recommend that to everyone. It's funny and dark, and managing those two tones at the same time is really kind of virtuosic. Brenda Shaughnessy's book, Tanya, is really, really good. It just came out. Everybody should read it. What else am I reading right now? J. Stanislaw Lopez's book, We Borrowed Gentleness, from Alice James, is incredibly good. It's like philosophy and poetry at the same time. Yeah, Saeed Jones' Alive at the End of the World is one I'm sort of reading very slowly, kind of trying to take into, thinking about a lot of things. Yeah, and then I have a pile of novels by my bed that I'm reading. Like right now I'm rereading some Iris Murdoch novels, like Under the Net, and next I'm going to come back to The Sea. She's very funny, which is good for bedtime reading.
Were there, and I'm thinking specifically of like the Wanda poems, were there any books or poets that you sort of turned to that helped become a bit of a model for maybe the structure of the book or the poems themselves?
Yeah, I don't know about the structure, but I guess, yeah, thinking about persona poems, I spent a lot of time when it first came out with Victoria Chang's book, Barbie Chang, which that persona has a different relationship, I think, maybe to the poet than I do to Wanda, but it's a similar kind of like named alter ego, right? That character that moves through poems. I don't know. I want more books like that. I need some more recommendations for that kind of reading, because I'm very interested in sort of poetic alter egos, especially named ones that might recur. Yeah.
Fernando Pessoa.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate. Well, thank you so much, Margaret, for being with us tonight and sharing your work. If you wouldn't mind reading one more poem to leave us with, we would appreciate it. But I'm going to sign off. And again, thanks for being here. And thanks to everybody who came out too.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions and for your work with this book and spending time with it. Yeah, it's a real honor. All right, I have one more poem because it's finally spring in New Jersey. I feel like we just had this in the last week, all the trees have bloomed and the leaves are starting to come out. It's all happening, and the sun is like a drug that makes things feel possible again. So I have this one sort of euphoric poem near the end of the book that I'll read that's about spring in New Jersey, which is where I live now, and I feel sort of a protective love for it as an adoptive home state. It's called Garden State. The world smells green and wet, and today I am in a post-lapsarian good mood as I meander by the Raritan Canal, no longer moving in a deadly torpor like a winter fly, but thinking once again, the warming weather, about sex in a good way, how all those smells you're supposed to be ashamed of or wash away smell good once you know a thing or two. And it's finally humid enough this second day after the rains. It is spring in New Jersey. I itch my eyes freely and blink down on gnats that seem determined to die in my field of so close I can't see them. And people are out. Look at all their beautiful bodies. So many ankles and knees, clicking whiz of bike wheels, car exhaust hanging in the thick air, helmets pressing sweaty hair to sticky foreheads, a racket of motors on the other side of these trees. Early evening, the light just now is furtive, holy. This is no prologue, but thing itself, the mud and the grease and the grass and the wet asphalt on one of those steaming, streaming, sunlit evenings after a week of rain that brought out the frogs to cover the road up the hill. There they were, No one knew where they were going. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for the reading. Thank you also to Peter for the conversation and to all of you for joining us tonight. The link to the book is in the chat for anyone who is interested. Thank you again, Margaret, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, y'all.